When Canada defeated the U.S. on the land, Trump wanted to buy Greenland was once just a distant icy island, but by 2025 it had become the focal point of a global power game. While President Trump loudly declared he would annex Greenland at all costs, Canada, quietly, strategically, and without a single boastful word, shattered that dream with a $3 billion mining deal. And so, instead of becoming America's 51st state, Greenland rose as a new geopolitical stronghold, where the U.S. was pushed out of the game and Canada and Europe held all the aces. Greenland. The geopolitical quake, born from what sounded like a joke. On a March morning in 2025, the world held its breath as U.S. President Donald Trump stood before Congress and declared, in his familiar tone, "We will annex Greenland into the United States, one way or another." A statement that sounded more like a TV comedy line than a serious geopolitical policy. But for those who had followed the Trump administration through 2 terms, no one was surprised anymore. The real surprise came in the reaction, not from Beijing, not from Brussels, but from Ottawa. Until then, everyone thought Greenland was a bilateral issue between the U.S. and Denmark, the country that holds sovereignty over the territory. Trump had already expressed his love for the Arctic island back in his first term in 2019, when he proposed buying Greenland and was flatly rejected. That dream seemed long buried, but when he returned to the White House in 2024, the ambition suddenly revived, this time disguised under the banner of national security, resource economics, and strategic positioning in the Arctic century. Yet while Washington was broadcasting signals of militarization and colonization of Greenland, an unexpected power stepped onto the stage. Canada. No declarations of sovereignty, no threats of sanctions, no military pressure, just a series of quiet economic handshakes, and Ottawa did what Washington couldn't: win the heart and the treasure chest of Greenland. From another angle, this is a story of 2 approaches to power. One side is the roar of an empire, domination, coercion, and betting on fear. The other is the strategy of a middle power, investment, dialogue, and trust building. While Trump dug up Cold War-era documents to justify Greenland's strategic location, arguing its northern coastline created a radar blind spot threatening Alaska's security, international experts were looking at a different set of numbers: 38 billion tons of rare earths and 17 billion barrels of untapped oil buried beneath the icy ground. Greenland, at its core, was never about a sovereignty conflict. It was a modern-day treasure hunt, in which the Americans knocked with army boots, while the Canadians opened the gate with green investment deals. And here's the real point. Trump didn't just fail because Denmark said no. He failed because he underestimated the national consciousness of the Greenlandic people, a small but resilient nation. When he referred to their country as a strategic asset that could be purchased, he touched something sacred: dignity. The response from the Greenlandic people, neither angry nor extreme, was simply, "We are not for sale." That sentence carried no military weight, but it held a moral force that made the world listen. It was in that silence that Canada entered, not to buy, not to seize, but to cooperate. Ottawa understood that to be part of Greenland's future didn't require ownership, just smart presence and respect. From that perspective, Trump didn't fail due to lack of money or influence, but because he lacked soft strategy. In a post-globalization world where power is redefined beyond weapons and GDP, trust, and the ability to read the other side's needs, has become a commodity more valuable than any mineral. In less than 6 months from a shocking statement before U.S. Congress, the Arctic chessboard was flipped. The U.S., once the only country with a major military base in Greenland, was now pushed to the sidelines of every significant agreement. In its place, A new alliance emerged: Greenland, Canada, European Union. A golden triangle that brought in billions of dollars in investment and laid the foundation for an Arctic development model based on sustainability, indigenous identity, and self-determination. Greenland was once a joke. Now it is the serious answer to a difficult question. Who is the true power player of the 21st century? Not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who understands best. Some lands don't need to be conquered. They only need to be accompanied. Canada. The quiet move that won Greenland's heart. While Washington was still scrambling to convince the Senate about the Greenland dream, Ottawa had already moved quietly. No noise, no sensationalism, no claims of sovereignty, just a series of skillfully negotiated deals, a chain of contracts signed at the right time, and an approach that made the Greenlanders feel heard, not priced. No one expected Canada to be the main player in the Greenland story. For decades, Canada had often been described with words like mild, neutral, or modest. But in the Arctic standoff of 2025, that very modesty became its sharpest weapon. While the U.S. chose to flaunt power, Canada chose to embed trust. And the remarkable thing was, they didn't just succeed. They accomplished what even Europe hadn't anticipated. It all started with a name few had heard of: Greenland Resources Incorporated, a mid-sized mining company in Ontario that had previously focused only on molybdenum, a little-mentioned metal but a silent pillar of high-tech steel production. When Europe passed the Strategic Raw Materials Act in 2023, requiring at least 25% of rare earth sources to come from trusted partner countries, Greenland suddenly became a golden land. But to turn that potential into reality required one thing the U.S. had already lost: the trust of the Greenlandic people. Ottawa understood it couldn't just bring money and take away the ore. They needed to leave something behind, and so a unique financial structure was born. Greenland Resources didn't sign a direct contract with the U.S. government, but partnered with the European Green Investment Bank, Denmark's Export Credit Agency, and local stakeholders to offer a proposal Copenhagen couldn't refuse. A 30-year contract focused on long-term development with key conditions: 70% local labor and 10% of profits directed to Greenland's future fund. No shadow of the Pentagon. No military clauses. No political strings attached. Just a simple promise: develop together. And that promise, in the midst of the Arctic's howling wind and snow, prevailed. At the same time, another name from Toronto emerged: Amaroq Minerals, a mining company operating from North America to Northern Europe, which had previously failed due to harsh environmental conditions. But they didn't give up. They returned to Greenland with a proposal to revive the Nalanino gold mine, a place once deemed too cold to profit. The difference this time? They didn't go alone. In less than 3 months, Amaroq successfully raised over £45 million, including capital from Danish IPOs, Norwegian pension funds, and even private American investment firms. Money that, ironically, worked against the policy of their own government. In that context, the U.S. was completely passive. American defense corporations like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, which relied on molybdenum for weapons technology, began sounding the alarm as Greenland's supply redirected toward Europe. America's electric vehicle production incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act suddenly revealed a gaping hole. They had never accounted for rare earths coming from a partner they assumed was already theirs. American media called it a soft coup. But for Canadians, this wasn't a coup. It was a new way to play. They didn't come to take Greenland, but to do business with Greenland in a way the Greenlanders saw as fair. They didn't use the word colonize. They used the word cooperate. No declarations of sovereignty, no imposition of policies, just one ongoing reality: Canadian money flowing in, Greenland's minerals flowing out, and Washington left with old maps and unsigned memorandums. Canada's success wasn't measured by how much rare earths they extracted, but by the message they sent. Arctic power no longer belongs to the loudest voice, but to the one others trust most in the long run. And with Greenland, Canada achieved that. Not through words, but through contracts. Not through weapons, but through respect. Not through pressure, but through commitment. Amid the ice and the minerals, something warm has been planted: trust. And Canada is now harvesting it, 1 ton of molybdenum at a time. Washington on the sidelines. When America became a stranger in its own game. If there were one image that encapsulated the U.S.'s geopolitical failure in Greenland, it would be the closed-door meeting on March 18, 2025, at the U.S. Department of State, where a development cooperation memorandum between Washington, Copenhagen, and Nuuk was flatly rejected. No debate, no hedging, just a brief message from Greenland: we won't sign anything that violates our sovereignty. And just like that, the U.S. was officially pushed out. For years, the United States was the sole power with a major military base in Greenland, Thule Air Base, a Cold War relic. They were used to being there, used to feeling entitled, and above all, used to seeing Greenland as an indispensable strategic buffer zone. But what Washington wasn't used to was a Greenland that could say no. That rejection didn't appear suddenly. It was the result of months, even years, in which the U.S. chose the wrong approach. When Trump stood before Congress and declared he would annex Greenland one way or another, he didn't just anger Denmark, he insulted an entire native culture. When Eisenhower-era documents were pulled from the archives, dating back to when Greenland didn't even have self-rule, he showed the world one thing: the U.S. government was still thinking in 20th century terms, in a game that had moved into the 21st. While Canada presented cooperation terms emphasizing indigenous ownership, transparent profit sharing, and alignment with European law, the U.S. sent military delegations, energy advisors, and even proposals to lease vast mineral-rich territories long-term. Washington failed to realize, or deliberately ignored, that Greenland was no longer empty ground. It was a nation defining its identity, seeking independence, and above all, unwilling to be a pawn. The bitter irony: it was U.S. businesses themselves that unintentionally helped empower the very forces pushing America out. Many investment funds from New York, Boston, and California, seeing massive profit potential in Greenland, poured money into Canadian firms like Amaroq Minerals without regard for geopolitical consequences. That capital flow, unwittingly, reinforced the Canada-Greenland-Europe alliance and weakened Washington's bargaining position. When Greenland officially passed the Arctic Infrastructure Law in July 2025, requiring all mining projects to have at least 70% local labor and 10% of profits allocated to a future fund, American companies could hardly comply. Not because they lacked resources, but because they weren't used to playing by someone else's rules. Meanwhile, Canadian, Norwegian, and even British firms swiftly adapted, hiring cultural consultants, training local workers, and committing to transparent profit disclosures. American rigidity and pride became fatal weaknesses. While Washington debated internally whether to sanction Denmark or cut NATO aid, one fact had become clear: Greenland didn't need the U.S. to develop. In reality, all reconciliation efforts from the U.S. State Department were seen as too little, too late. When Denmark and Nuuk issued a joint statement on March 12, rejecting any negotiations involving sovereignty transfer, they weren't just answering Trump. They were sending a warning to all of NATO. Any coercive action could fracture the alliance. The situation grew so tense that France deployed a nuclear submarine to Baffin Bay, not to confront the U.S., but to signal Europe's strategic presence in the Arctic. At the same time, European development banks committed to funding a new civilian airport in Greenland, transforming what was once a Cold War military hub into a civilian gateway to the world. As those things unfolded, the U.S. was no longer a main player. It became an outsider, immensely powerful but no longer respected. And in a land as frozen as Greenland, where no one wins with gunfire but through consensus, America is slowly becoming a lonely giant, an empire that hasn't yet understood. Power today isn't about how many aircraft carriers you have. It's about how many nations still want to shake your hand. Greenland law. When a small island redefined. How the world does business. No need to declare independence. No need for a new national flag. Greenland has done what many small nations only dream of, forcing global powers to play by its rules. And in the very moment the U.S. was pushed out of negotiations, a new reality began to take shape. Greenland was no longer a land to be developed by others, but a player capable of deciding who gets to enter and under what conditions. Everything shifted from what seemed like a simple administrative law, the Greenland Arctic Infrastructure Act, passed in July 2025. But its 17 provisions quickly became a geopolitical earthquake for international investors. No one expected that, in the icy expanse thousands of kilometers from Brussels, Ottawa, or Washington, there would be a self-governing authority strong enough to design a legal framework that forced the world to take a serious second look. The crux wasn't in the numbers. Though 70% local labor, 10% of profits into the future fund, and the requirement that all environmental data must be publicly disclosed may sound strict, the real value of the law lay in the message it sent. Greenland is not a place to exploit and abandon, but a land to be nurtured, developed, and shared equitably. For many Western corporations, this came as a shock. For decades, the resource development model followed the same old script. Corporations arrive, bring capital, promise jobs and a school or two, then quietly ship out millions of tons of minerals. Greenland shattered that model, not with protest, but with law. And the most surprising part? The Nordic countries, Canada, and even some British corporations agreed to the new rules. That consensus didn't come from coercion. It emerged from a shifting geopolitical landscape. As the U.S. isolated itself with its own heavy-handed strategy, a power vacuum opened, and Canada quickly stepped in, not just with money, but by aligning with Greenland's legal framework, accepting every condition that had made American firms hesitate. A prime example is the deal between Greenland Resources and the government of Nuuk. Instead of negotiating the traditional way, the company established a full operational branch in Greenland, hired local lawyers, opened a civil office to handle citizen complaints, and committed to transparent profit reporting with local authorities, mirroring the Maori Stability Fund model once used in New Zealand. This wasn't a PR stunt. It was a serious strategy to reduce risk in a politically sensitive region. And they weren't alone. Amarok Minerals, whose Nalanino gold mine had been abandoned due to extreme weather, returned with a thoroughly trained team, including local engineers, Greenlandic language interpreters, and cultural consultants, things no U.S. project had ever done. They didn't come to take over, they came to build together. All of this set a new standard. No land is too small to set the rules. Once considered a white space on the global economic map, Greenland is now teaching the world that sovereignty doesn't require weapons or armies. It only needs clear laws, consistent willpower, and the ability to say no at the right time. The consequences for the U.S. were clear. As major corporations began getting disqualified from tenders for failing to comply with Greenland's law, domestic political pressure mounted. Senators like Lisa Murkowski, Alaska, and Joe Manchin, West Virginia, spoke out, urging the Department of Commerce to rethink its approach so that defense and high-tech industries wouldn't face supply chain crises because they didn't read the rules of a tiny island carefully enough. But the bigger question is Washington ready to change? Can it accept a world where it is no longer the one writing the rules, but the one that must follow them? Greenland has shown, to survive in the New World, you don't have to be a superpower. You just need to know what you want and refuse to let anyone cross your line. Amid the freezing winds and ice, in a place no one thought could give rise to a fair development model, Greenland chose to redraw its borders, not on the map, but on legal paper. And the world, one step at a time, is being forced to read the fine print before signing. The Arctic Hexagon. When Canada quietly shaped a new world order, no grand strategic declarations, no press conferences at Davos, no calls for revolutionizing like the US usually does. And yet, Canada, in its characteristic quietness, is silently building a new economic technological order called the Arctic Hexagon. This concept, first mentioned by Toronto media in May 2025, may sound abstract, but for those closely following global geopolitical shifts, that hexagon is the symbol of how Canada is quietly connecting 6 strategic points across the Arctic. From the iron mines of Baffin Island, the rare earth mines in Greenland, to the NASA CSA bilateral space station in Iqaluit, and even offshore energy hubs in Newfoundland and Labrador. No longer a bystander among superpowers, Canada is stepping into the center of the new influence map, not with force, but with data corridors, logistics infrastructure, and a commitment to sustainable development. In that game, Greenland is the keystone, where natural resources are not just economically valuable, but also strategic cards that define the entire Western supply chain in the post-globalization era. While the U.S. struggles to reassert its role in Greenland with symbolic military proposals, Canada has taken a step ahead, establishing an integrated infrastructure system that supports extraction, transportation, and distribution of resources through tightly linked networks with Europe. A clear example is the trilateral agreement between Canada, Greenland, the European Energy Research Alliance, ERIA, funding a mining rail line from the molybdenum site to Nuuk port, cutting the shipping time to Hamburg to under 9 days, instead of the previous 3 weeks. All of the hexagon junctions were designed with a guiding philosophy: cooperation instead of control. No military bases, no enforcement surveillance systems, but rather a network of logistics centers, high-tech laboratories, and even indigenous research institutes, serving the dual purpose of green technology development and respect for native cultures. The most important highlight is the collaboration between the Canadian Space Agency, CSA, and NASA in deploying a satellite array to monitor Arctic climate change with the main data receiving station placed in Greenland. Under a scientific facade, this is a strategic move allowing Canada to control remote sensing data on ice melt, sea levels, and maritime activity, what many now call the oil of the 21st century in the global data economy. No soldiers involved, but 24/7 satellite imagery is no less powerful. In addition to science and resources, Canada is also betting on soft infrastructure, law, and trust. Thanks to its intermediary role between Europe and Greenland, Ottawa has become a transit hub of credibility, a place where investors go to avoid U.S. political risk while still maintaining access to Western markets. That explains why pension funds from Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands are pouring billions of dollars into Arctic Hexagon projects, described as the first sustainable development complex in the high Arctic. What's most remarkable is, Canada isn't doing this alone. Each node of the hexagon is linked to a partner. Norway in LNG energy, France in airport infrastructure, Germany in recycled steel supply chains, Iceland in hydrogen refueling stations, and Europe in general in the role of environmental oversight. The result is a nameless but powerful alliance, a block of soft power convergence that the U.S. cannot squeeze into with just military presence or exclusive terms. In the past, people used to say, "Whoever controls the Strait of Malacca controls world trade." In 2025, that saying could be rewritten as, "Whoever controls the rare earth mines of Greenland controls the clean energy supply chain of the 21st century." And Canada is doing just that. Not with shouts on television, but with the soft knocks of gavels in quiet meeting rooms in Brussels and Nuuk. As the world enters an era of strategic material scarcity, especially in alloys for high-tech industries, the Arctic hexagon is no longer just a concept. It's the map of the future, where Canada is no longer America's gentle neighbor but the silent architect of a new Arctic order. Geopolitics from a metal bar. When molybdenum pushed Washington to the brink. In August 2025, during a tense hearing before the U.S. Senate, a representative from Lockheed Martin, the leading defense contractor, unexpectedly announced the suspension of hypersonic weapons testing due to a shortage of raw material. Molybdenum, a silvery gray metal, rarely mentioned in press conferences, but vital for heat-resistant steel structures, jet engine casings, and even high-speed drone bodies. A few weeks later, Raytheon declared it was seeking supplies from Chile and Australia. But prices were soaring, shipping times were extended, and quality remained inconsistent. A defense expert, speaking anonymously, sighed. "We used to think molybdenum was just a secondary input. Now it's determining the heartbeat of the entire weapon system." And the most painful part? The most reliable supply in the world, located in Greenland, is now being shipped directly to Europe, under the sponsorship of Canada. That event wasn't just a supply chain disruption. It was the clearest proof yet that Washington had lost control precisely when geopolitics was shifting faster than ever. While the Trump administration remained focused on symbolism, slogans like "Greenland must be ours" and sovereignty-laden speeches, other countries saw the real prize. The energy of the future doesn't lie in oil, but in rare elements frozen under layers of thousand-year-old ice. Not just molybdenum. Greenland holds vast reserves of graphite, zirconium, niobium, and especially rare earth isotopes classified by the EU as strategically essential in its Carbon Neutrality Plan 2035. As the West rushes to reduce dependence on China, which dominates 70% of the global rare earth market, Greenland has become the Arctic Pandora, a place every tech corporation wants a foothold in. But only those willing to follow the new rules, set by Nuuk itself, are handed the key. And here, once again, Canada demonstrates the strategic finesse of a middle power. It doesn't compete for molybdenum by buying it outright. It builds a value chain around it, from extraction, processing, to transportation logistics, all integrated into Europe's steel industry, which urgently needs heat-resistant metals to produce EV battery casings and next-gen hydrogen storage devices. By contrast, the U.S. is trapped by the very protectionist policies it created. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, of 2022, once hailed as a Marshall Plan for the battery industry, had a glaring flaw. It didn't account for the possibility that Greenland, its longtime ally, might choose a different path. As a result, tax incentives only apply to materials sourced from North America, while Greenland no longer considers itself America's backyard. For American tech corporations, this creates a painful dilemma. To qualify for IRA tax breaks, they must produce domestically, something that takes years and faces environmental resistance. If they import from Greenland, they lose the tax advantages. Either way, they're retreating, while Canada and Europe advance. That reality has fractured political air in Congress. Republican senators accuse Greenland of being manipulated by global interests. Some Democrats call for peaceful dialogue and a resource-sharing framework. But one thing both sides silently acknowledge: the game has changed hands. The U.S. is no longer the dealer. Amidst all this, in Ottawa, Canada's Ministry of Industry announced a plan to establish the Arctic Strategic Materials Reserve, linking Greenland to smelting plants in Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, allowing Canada to be fully self-sufficient in molybdenum until 2040. With one brief press release, Ottawa declared what Washington was still debating: strategic autonomy doesn't need to come with conflict. The U.S. may possess aircraft carriers, a global satellite system, and the largest defense budget in the world. But in a world where a single metal bar can make a satellite fly or fall, power no longer comes solely from weapons, but from understanding what truly counts as a resource. And this time, Canada understood first. Greenland agreed first, and the U.S., like a hasty giant, only started running after the door had already closed. Greenland is not selling itself. It's defining itself. If in the early years of the 21st century, Greenland was a name that appeared on the map as a cold geographical footnote, then by 2025, that name carries political and economic weight that no one can ignore. Not because someone bought Greenland, on the contrary, because no one can buy it anymore. After decades of being seen as Denmark's strategic satellite, after many instances of being referred to as a negotiable territory, Greenland quietly did the most important thing: set the standards for development, cooperation, and existence. In a world where sovereignty is challenged by trade, data, and resources, Greenland did not choose to be a victim. It chose to be the one writing the rules. This is most clearly reflected in how they used soft power to protect their young political structure. Instead of chasing an uncontrolled wave of investment, they built legal barriers, demanded profit sharing, environmental transparency, and prioritized indigenous communities. They didn't reject corporations, but forced them to change. And if they wouldn't comply, the door would close without argument. That stance was clearly emphasized in the joint statement on March 12, 2025, between Nuuk and Copenhagen. We reject all negotiations regarding the transfer of sovereignty in any form. Any coercive action will be considered a violation of international legal order and NATO solidarity principles. A cold yet highly rational statement, excluding the U.S., not emotionally, but by legal logic and alliance interests. What surprised many observers even more was, Greenland is not alone. Not long after that statement, France deployed the nuclear submarine Sovereign to Baffin Bay. Germany approved a credit package to invest in a civilian airport in Greenland, and Nordic banks simultaneously provided financial support for sustainable projects on the island. Meanwhile, the U.S., despite having a long-standing military base, was rejected from participating in a civilian port development program. That divide didn't stem from geography, but from approach. Washington came to Greenland like a boss negotiating price. Ottawa came like a partner, asking what you need to begin. One side set conditions. The other listened and adapted. In the modern geopolitical game, that difference determines the winner. And the winner this time belongs to the multilateral model. When Canada, the EU, Norway, and even private investors from the UK simultaneously joined the conditional development model in Greenland, based on risk sharing, respect for indigenous culture, and long-term commitment, one thing became clear. Greenland doesn't have to choose between independence and dependence. It can hold on to sovereignty and develop economically, if it chooses the right partners. That reality even forced American politicians to reflect. Senator Lisa Murkowski, Alaska, stated before Congress, "It's not the stronger side who wins. The one who listens and invests in the right values will be the last one left in the negotiation room." In a world where trust is the strongest currency, Greenland has learned how to manage its credibility, not as a territory, but as a nation. And that's the key point. Greenland is no longer just a territory. It has become a political entity, a place where indigenous people don't just live by tradition, but also draft mining policies, build strategic infrastructure, negotiate with investment banks, and simultaneously protect their cultural, linguistic, and natural rights. That redefinition: no guns, no United Nations vote, no independence declaration, is Greenland's quiet yet radiant victory. And perhaps it's also Trump's most painful defeat. He didn't just fail to buy Greenland. He witnessed an island he once saw as a commodity become a country.